Hello, my name is Andrea Gonzalez, and I'm glad you joined us today. We are going to wait another minute or two for our attendees to file in. Okay, it's leveled off a bit, so we will move forward. Again, my name is Andrea Gonzalez, and I'm glad that you joined us today. You've tuned in to the Trellis Strategies Parenting Student Support discussion. We are passionate about bringing awareness and support to this dedicated population of modern learners. I will now hand over the facilitation to our Trellis Strategies Managing Director, Bryan Ashton.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you everybody for joining us today. Here at Trellis Strategies, we're really excited to convene this conversation to talk about student parents. And this has been a topic that we've been really interested in from a research perspective and have really utilized a lot of our student financial wellness survey data to help understand the lived experiences of student parents, especially as kind of the parent persona intersects with their academic persona, and then oftentimes an employment persona for those students as well. So we're going to really jump in here today and begin this conversation. As we've found in our data, and it's replicated in national data, close to or more than 1 in 5 students report being a student parent. For us, more than a quarter of those that 2-year institutions and about 15% of those at 4-year institutions indicated that they were parents. We also know that these populations really have a lot of intersectionality between other populations that we care deeply about. So first generation students. And they're also more likely to do things like attend classes online or in a hybrid status. And they're more likely to have some of those work experiences as well. And so this will be a really great conversation about some of those intersecting identities that our student parents experience as well. We have 3 great panelists with us here today, and at Trellis Strategies, we're incredibly fortunate to get the opportunity not only to talk with both Renee and Theresa here today, but also to work with them on a variety of different projects. And so I'm really excited for their insights today. I'm going to let everybody introduce themselves, but I'll start with Allyson Cornett here at Trellis Strategies.
Perfect. Thanks, Bryan. My name is Allyson Cornett, and I'm the manager of the Qualitative Learner Insights team here at Trellis Strategies. My background is in applied anthropology and public health with a focus on behavioral and community health. And a lot of my research here at Trellis focuses on the factors that influence student success, including basic needs security and mental health, but also trying to better understand how to support our special student populations, including parenting students. I oversee all of our qualitative research projects here at Trellis, including co-leading our annual Student Financial Wellness Survey, or SFWS, which is a free of charge national survey project that investigates the wellness of college students at hundreds of institutions, including the experiences and challenges faced by parenting students. So we just closed our 2024 survey yesterday, so we haven't had a chance to dive into that data just yet. But in our survey from last year, the 2023 Student Financial Wellness Survey, we were fortunate to highlight the voices of nearly 12,000 student parents attending 142 institutions across the country. Our research has found that student parents encounter basic needs insecurities and financial challenges at higher rates than their non-parenting counterparts, and that their experiences vary by age. Parenting students, for instance, under the age of 25 are much more likely to experience these conditions than their peers 25 or older. Before we dive in too much, I want to pass off to my other fellow panelists to introduce themselves, and let's start with Dr. Theresa Anderson.
Thank you so much, Allyson. It's a pleasure to be here today. I am Theresa Anderson. I am a senior researcher at the Urban Institute, which is based in Washington, D.C., although like many organizations, we are widespread these days, have folks from all over the country, and we also don't only work on urban issues, but focus on social policy across the spectrum. The Urban Institute is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research and policy organization really focused on trying to think about and inform solutions to some of the broad policy and social issues that face folks, primarily in the United States today. My work focuses on making education pathways accessible. I say I focus on the whole life course from early childhood to adulthood, but I especially have put a lot of effort into thinking about post-secondary pathways within the broader context of folks, families, and communities, and being able to support the entire family and their educational goals and well-being through education access and resources. So a lot of that has manifested in work on student parents. I actually did my dissertation research on moms who go back to school and then sort of stumbled upon the student parent space. Having done that research, I think others have been in that position where you start looking at this population because it makes a lot of sense and then realize others are having similar conversations. And it's always valuable to loop in. So that's one of the goals. Renee, who will introduce herself in a moment, and I co-lead with others, or we say steward, a new initiative called the Student Parent Action Through Research Knowledge, the SPARK Collaborative. And the goal of SPARK is largely so that people don't feel like they're stumbling around and finding things out in silos, but that that you can connect with data, insights, folks across the field, resources, and be able to kind of build on the work that others have done. And so that's been a big element of our work together. But I also, within my role at the Urban Institute, have been conducting mixed methods research on issues and opportunities, issues affecting student parents and opportunities to better support education pathways for parents and their children. And I'm glad to share more detail about that, but I don't want to take up the whole webinar with just the intro. So it is very nice to meet you all here today, and I will pass it to Renee.
Thanks, Theresa, and thanks, Bryan, for inviting me here today. So I'm Renee Ryberg. I am a sociologist by training, and I'm a senior research scientist at Child Trends. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan research group studying anything and everything having to do with children and families. I am in Durham, North Carolina. Let's see. I come at studying student parents really from two angles. One is the kind of individual angle. I have a background in studying the transition to adulthood, which is just a really messy time in life. In the transition to adulthood, people are moving out of their parents' houses, they are starting jobs, they're in school, they're forming families, and it's all happening at the same time. And that's especially true for parenting students, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And then the second angle I bring is the more institutional, contextual angle, thinking about the systems that student parents interact with. And there's a lot of them: higher education, employment, public benefits, childcare, and really thinking about the mismatch between those, how those institutions were designed, who they were designed to serve, and the realities of the lives of student parents. So I'll just give you one kind of interesting finding from a recent report that was just put out through the SPARK Collaborative by me and a couple of colleagues, including 2 student parent fellows. So in this report, we're looking at the financial well-being of student parents. And what we found was that student parents have higher expenses than students without children. It's not surprising. If anybody here is a parent, you know kids are expensive. But at the same time, those higher expenses are not taken into account in most financial aid calculations. So student parents are more likely to pay for their own housing expenses, and they pay nearly 50% more on average for housing, but that's not part of the financial aid calculation. I'll just leave that little nugget there.
Great. Thank you all. And thank you all for, kind of highlighting the diverse perspectives that you bring to these conversations. I wanted to start the conversation sort of building off of some of what we heard in those intros. And oftentimes, I think when we talk with policymakers or when we hear conversations in the field about student parents, it's painted as one population, but there's a lot of diversity within the student parent demographic. And so I was, this is open to anybody to start with here around how do you define student parents and what do you see within the student parent population, and how do those experiences differ for different student parents?
I'll say, I'll jump in if that's helpful. I'll say that at the most nuanced level, every individual experience is going to be different, right? So every person has complex lives. Parenting students who, as Bryan framed very helpfully, are often balancing not only education and parenthood, but also employment, So they're balancing these three big public roles as well as their own, humanity and trying to be healthy and well-rounded person. There are a range of, experiences that come down to the individual. But of course, when we think about broader groups and themes, some of the things that we see that are kind of common issues that can vary for different populations are role strain, time poverty, a gap in belongingness, and those are negatives, but I'll also say something we see commonly is high motivation. Because if somebody's willing to take on wear these multiple big hats and pursue education while balancing all these other things, they're very committed to their education pathway. And we see that in student parents having comparable, if not higher grades than non-parenting students and pursuing rigorous pathways, but having a lot more barriers to completion. I will say that those barriers are higher among students who identify as Black or African American. They're also higher for folks who have complex intersectional systems involvement, whether that's, navigating immigration or justice system or other different systems that have less support. Some people are in systems that have more support. Veterans tend to have somewhat more support, even as there are other challenges. And so I think that there are a range of barriers that one thing that has been important for our work is to ensure that we frame those barriers as more structural than personal, because most of the barriers that student parents encounter have policy or practice solutions to them and don't just come down to personal failings, because as I said, this is a highly motivated, highly capable population. So that's my thought on that.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Dr. Anderson just said. Student parents are incredibly diverse. They represent a mosaic of backgrounds, experiences, and intersecting identities. And overall, parenting students are more likely to enroll part-time, be employed part-time or full-time, and also be the first in their family to attend college. So this can have real impacts on their experiences on campus, especially as a combination of these factors may limit their time to be physically available on campus. And that can kind of hinder their awareness of on-campus resources or maybe even off-campus partnerships that their institution may have with community-based organizations, which makes it really crucial for institutions to have inclusive support services to better support this population.
Yeah, and thinking about the idea of inclusive support services, everyone has said student parents are diverse. Parenting is obviously a very important identity among student parents, but other identities don't get checked at the door. So a Latino student parent is navigating college as a Latino and as a parent. So any additional barriers that may come with other identities, or not really with the identities, but the systems that they're interacting with, are still there. So, for example, dads are commonly overlooked. We know that men in college tend to have lower GPAs than women, but dads actually have better GPAs than most parents, or most students. And so all of those layers of identity really layer on top of each other. So as part of the Spark Center, one of the series of products we just put out was a series of infographics that hone in on, I think it's 17 different populations within the student parent population. So we have an infographic on veteran student parents. We have an infographic on student fathers, on young parents, on, American Indian, Alaska Native student parents, et cetera, to really highlight and celebrate the diversity of identities.
And I just put a link to those one-pagers in the chat, the one-page profiles that Renee was referencing, as well as a longer report with more detail. But we hope that also elevates the importance of considering the different experiences that students more broadly are bringing into higher education, in addition to the intersection with this parenting role, which adds that dimensional complexity.
Thank you all for that. And I love those one pagers and really encourage everybody to check those out. I think there's a lot of good information and data in there to help inform the conversations that you're probably having on your campuses. We talked a lot kind of there about the different personas that students are engaging with. And, we talk a lot at Trellis Strategies about this idea of like what we call the modern learner, and that the modern learner, one of the trends that we feel like we see is that the student persona becomes increasingly pushed down, right, in terms of the priority personas that students are engaging with. Would love to maybe spend a little bit more time thinking about, as you have those different personas that students are experiencing, in this case, a student parent or a parent persona being a part of that. How does that impact the student's ability to engage with the campus? We talked a little bit about sense of belonging and some of those other pieces earlier. And then we also talked a little bit about academic performance, and would love to unpack that a little bit more here. So Allyson, I don't know, maybe I'll start with you this time and then move from there.
Yeah, for sure. So, I think we know that student parents often face more barriers to engaging with their institution than their non-parenting peers due to their dual roles as a student and a parent. And many times these student parents are performing kind of a balancing act between their parenting duties, academics, employment, and their other obligations outside of those three areas. And these time constraints can be even more severe for student parents over the age of 25. In the fall 2023 Student Financial Wellness Survey, we found that student parents who are 25 or older were more likely to work 40 or more hours a week while enrolled. And that's a significant level of responsibility combined with going to college, taking care of their children, and then managing other responsibilities that they have in their personal lives. And this all kind of leads to parenting students being less able to engage in campus activities or networking events due to this time poverty that they experience. Research also shows that students with dependent children are more likely to feel disconnected and that low sense of belonging that we keep coming back to when they're on campus. And that just makes it super important for institutions to proactively engage with these students and faculty members, especially as the kind of the face of the institution. They interact with students the most, especially faculty members can play a really important role here by being flexible and demonstrating empathy to these students. And really having a positive and supportive academic environment can make a huge difference in academic performance and sense of belonging and engagement. And I think we keep going back to this, but despite these challenges that student parents are experiencing, they are highly resilient, they are persistent, and previous research shows that they have clear goals in mind as they pursue higher education.
And if I could jump in with a few, I thought that was really well described, Allyson, and a few really concrete things, because this doesn't have to be extraordinarily complex, right? It's about design thinking. It's about being conscientious about the fact that students may have families and children that they are bringing with them in their lives and campus. I mean, we heard about, folks at a campus who they bought a really inexpensive little climber playground thing. And whenever they would have like a sporting event or an on-campus event that was outdoors, they would just put it somewhere on the grass and have it there so that it was sort of a welcome, kids can play on this, or having a coloring corner or kids activities, or having a separate space where you can put on a movie if there's an event where you need kids to be quiet, but they can be there. Like, some of this is just about being conscientious and thoughtful about what would make something feel welcoming for student parents. There's also dynamics in thinking about the delivery of academics. So because parenting students have very particular schedules, I don't know how many folks here are also parents, but you might recognize that, with kids, their, routines and their dinner and their school and their childcare, you have particular times that you're available that aren't always aligned with everybody else's time. So it's hard sometimes to do group work. It's hard to do extra things if there's extra labs or extra, activities that are maybe extra credit that you're missing out on, or student parents are more likely to be in online coursework. We've shown that in some of the research that we've completed, and having faculty think about how to allow for asynchronous engagement, even in an in-person class, or how to ensure that online spaces still build in belonging, because sometimes they can be kind of depersonalized from the institution, thinking about, what does it mean to offer extra credit or extra activities, which are great and enriching, but, giving folks ample notice, for example, so they can line up their childcare. Again, some of it's just about being thoughtful and conscientious. And honestly, you don't have to do that in a vacuum. Bringing student parents into the conversation to maybe advise the student activities or advise, the faculty senate or whoever it might be on how can we make this a little bit better for you all or people in your position, and having students share their expertise can be really valuable in finding effective solutions.
So a +1 to the idea of involving student parents in the design of anything touching their experience that could not be more important. One other layer to this conversation about belonging and connectivity is just simply about communication. People want to feel seen on campus and in their experiences. Generation Hope has done some work about how student parents feel disconnected from their campuses and just don't see themselves visually represented. So one positive example of, again, something that's pretty easy to do is Santa Fe Community College hired a photographer to take pictures of student parents and their children at family-friendly events around campus, on graduation day, pictures of parents with their children in the regalia, and just celebrating those milestones and the family-friendly events and opportunities. And then now they're using those on promotional materials. So, a parent on the fence, can I do this? Do I want to go back to school? If you then see a fellow parent on a promotional material, that says something about the school, about who is welcome there. And that's just hiring a photographer for the day. Something really simple.
Yeah, I'll just re-up how much that marketing matters and how much that is a lot of so student parents are disproportionately enrolled in private for-profit institutions. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But one of them is that those colleges explicitly reach out to parents and explicitly market to them, whether it's on billboards or commercials or just in their materials that they're doing outreach. And I think that public institutions can take a page from that to actively pursue a more diverse set of students, in particular parents, in relation to this discussion, but it can be other students who are less likely to be represented on college campuses, to try to recapture some of that potential enrollment population and to deliver a really high quality education for them.
Thank you all for that. And would, again, to Renee's point, +1, all of that from a conversation perspective. I think we've, done a really good job of starting to blend into kind of what are the support services that colleges and universities can offer to support student parents, and how can these be improved. And I know we have folks on from around the country, but we've seen great progress in Texas in terms of recognizing, the student parent demographic through some of the legislation that has been passed last legislative session, and helping student parents, hopefully, right, to be seen through implementation, helping student parents to be seen through liaisons and other support services that can help them to be successful. Wanted to just give a little bit of space. I know y'all sprinkled some into your previous answers, but if there are any, promising practices in terms of supporting student parents that you've seen on campus that we could highlight here, especially for a lot of the practitioners. And then, a second part of that is having the resources or putting in place the support is, oftentimes the first step. And I'll ask Allyson to highlight some of the research that we've done that shows the difference between awareness and, actually engage, the awareness of services versus the availability of services are two very different pieces. And so how do we go about raising awareness within a demographic, especially a demographic, as we've mentioned previously, that has multiple personas, experiences time poverty in a way that maybe other student demographics may not. So I would open that up to anybody for your thoughts.
I can kick us off with the most basic answer, which is data. We need more data on parenting students. So Texas is on it on this one, as are a couple of other states. There have recently been some laws passed requiring institutions to collect data on parenting status. But most institutions across the country, if you go and ask, hey, how many parents do you serve? They don't know the answer. And so without knowing the answer to that very basic question, how do you even start to say, okay, we need a child care center with X number of slots? Or, okay, to staff this event where we want families to come, we need X people. So just very basic kind of first entry level thing to do is collect data on parenting students, not just so you can count them, but then once they're identified, you can also start to send resources their way.
Yeah, if I hear data and I'm like, ooh, spidey senses are tingling. So Urban with our partners are working on an effort called the Data to Action Campaign for Parenting Students, which is basically in response to this rollout of legislation. And Michigan actually was the very first state to pass this, though it only lasted for a year there. But Oregon, Illinois, California, Texas, and now Minnesota have all passed legislation about collecting data on students' parenting status. Texas and Minnesota went further on providing additional supports, which is just fabulous. Texas has a mandatory student-parent liaison, priority registration for students who are parenting, as well as additional legally codified protections. Minnesota did all of that and added a little extra money to the pot. California, I should mention, also has priority registration. But all that said, the data piece is one that has been really tricky because A, parenting status is something that can change over time. So you don't just want to collect it at one point. And B, like, it's not just about collecting data, but using those data to meaningfully improve services and supports and to change policies that support parenting students, to Renee's point that you have to actually look at and use the data. So we've been working with a cohort of 10 grantees, 9 colleges and 1 citywide system across Oregon, Illinois, and California to think about promising practices and emerging promising practices around how those data could be collected and then how they can be used to affect change. And so I'm going to share the link to the website because we have a bunch of publications related to that that are really concrete. Like if you are an institutional researcher, here are things to think about how to do this. And then if you're a person who's like the Dean of Student Services, here's how you then leverage those data. So I think that is a huge starting point. I'll also just give another example of where data is really valuable, which is that one of the things that people talk about childcare a lot. Childcare is extraordinarily important. And it's also true that only about half of student parents have a child under age 6. So half is a huge portion, but if half have a child who's 6 or older, and that doesn't mean they don't need childcare, but it looks different than what you might assume if you think that all your student parents have like 2-year-olds. So thinking about what the actual profile is and needs are of the students is going to help you be able to apportion and direct, whether it's provide services or direct people to appropriate services and have the capacity to do that navigation so that students can connect with exactly what they need.
Yeah, and I think I'm going to touch a little bit on the financial vulnerability that we see among this population. The high cost of attending college, coupled with rising living expenses and high childcare costs, means that many of our parenting students are financially vulnerable. In the fall 2023 Student Financial Wellness Survey, we found that 68% of our students with children would have trouble getting $500 in cash or credit in order to meet an unexpected expense. This is not surprising, really, given that many non-college going adults would have difficulties meeting that same cost. But the combination of these stressful finances, limited resources, and these significant familial obligations do put our parenting students at greater risk of prematurely exiting their institution without a degree, which is when it becomes really critical for institutions and policymakers to offer these targeted supports that Dr. Ryberg and Dr. Anderson have been discussing. And obviously, what immediately comes to mind is on-campus childcare. But fewer than half of our institutions currently offer that to our students. And we also see that our parenting students also frequently struggle with meeting their basic needs, 52% of our student parents in the fall 2023 Student Financial Wellness Survey were food insecure. And targeting these basic need supports like assistance applying to public benefit programs, and then these physical resources like food pantries, and making sure that these supports work with their schedules and that they're accessible when they're available is really critical to supporting these students. But as Bryan mentioned, we do see a disconnect between awareness of these resources and utilization of what institutions are offering on campus. And we saw in our last survey that parenting students were less likely to be aware of on-campus food pantries and closets than their non-parenting counterparts by 5 percentage points. And that can make a real difference in their day-to-day lives and their ability to make ends meet for themselves and their families.
I don't mean to always be the one who's circling back around, and I just wanted to put in another plug really quickly for another resource that we developed a couple of years ago called the Roadmap for Change to Support Pregnant and Parenting Students. And this was informed by a leadership council of 45 thought leaders from across the field, including many with lived expertise, either as current or previous parenting students. And it's basically like a menu of opportunities to support student parents from a practice, a policy, a research, and an investment standpoint. We're working on like a searchable, sortable, updated version, but this, gives a lot of opportunities, ideas, and some concrete examples that hopefully would be useful to folks. And I will just note that there is a separate appendix that can be useful as like a little worksheet if you want to take notes as you're going through, because there's a lot in there. So hopefully that's a useful resource.
I'm gonna circle around on your circle around, Theresa, to the idea that I think we have all raised at this point of involving student parents in this process, whether it is in developing your data collection system of how to identify student parents, whether it is best communication practices on how to reach them. It's not via email. With the information, whether it is designing the hours that the food pantry is open. And I can just provide some examples that I've seen of how colleges have done this. One is a focus group, realistically a virtual focus group, so people's schedules align, with student parents talking about their needs, talking about different options. I've also seen surveys of students being analyzed to help identify the most critical barriers that student parents are facing and how likely students would be to use various services and supports if they were offered. And then levels of intensity of engagement can kind of go up from there in terms of having student parents as paid members of a team that is actually designing a service or offering a service. Peer navigators are an interesting model where I think, Allyson, you were talking about supporting student parents and applying for public benefits. If that person supporting you looks like you and went through that same experience as a student parent, say 2 years earlier, what we've heard from students is that there's a deeper level of connection and comfort in that interaction. Let's see. And then there's some structural approaches. Some schools have a student parent position on the student council, for example, that structurally builds in that representation of the parent experience. So there's a lot of different ways to go about involving student parents in the process that can be light touch to pretty intensive.
Yeah, thank you all for the resources here. I think one of the things that's really interesting from the conversation is that not unlike other student supports, but really for student parents, supporting them as a cross-campus effort, right? All the way from institutional research and collecting data and making sure we are able to have some of the data-informed conversations to your student activities, and everybody in between is engaged or should be engaged in these conversations, and would just highlight the menu and kind of the roadmap that Urban has put out. I think it's a really, really great tool, along with the rubric for how to, kind of work through implementing these initiatives. And so really encourage y'all to take a look at those two resources. One of the things that I wanted to ask y'all about, and wasn't something that we had talked about previously, but as we have these conversations, a lot of our conversations about different elements of basic needs, and in particular for student parents, like when we begin to think about childcare and some of the routines that we mentioned earlier, or that were mentioned earlier, really begin to become a conversation about how we can help students to navigate the course schedule, and when are courses available, how do we make sure that there's availability that also allows for progress towards degree, right? And so if like the only section that is available that is a prerequisite doesn't fit, creates some challenges. That's, I think something that Texas did with the legislation was to take a look at priority registration. Now, I think priority registration means something different on every campus, and what is priority and where does priority fall? And if everybody's priority, is it really priority type of thing? But would love your all's thoughts on, kind of a lot of the things that we've talked about are co-curricular, outside of the classroom, like some of those more actual degree pathway pieces. Are there anything that institutions can do to be more friendly to student parents through their course catalog or other pieces?
I think like an obvious answer is flexibility and having different options for how courses are delivered. Some student parents actually prefer to take shortened course terms because they just want to spend as little time. If they can do the 8-week version instead of the 10-week version or the 6-week version, like they'd rather just kind of do the intensive period and then be done. Some need a little more time and might want to kind of, do a 2-term version of what other be a 1-term class, which isn't very common, but institutions could think about where there's opportunities for that. Of course, evening and weekend, thinking about the scheduling of synchronous classes or the availability of asynchronous options for students. So I think scheduling is a big thing. I think another thing is about messaging that and policies that faculty have in the classroom and how those are communicated. So there have been some institutions that have worked on having syllabus statements that faculty can put on their syllabi, either that refers students to resources on campus or their rights under federal Title IX protections or other things, which not all states are doing, but that's a different story. But that also have kind of attendance policies that are humane. Like if you're sick, you're not expected to come to class, but also if your kid is sick, shouldn't be expected to have to come to class. That should be, an excused absence or have some way to make it up. Or, I taught a class in the spring and it was mostly an in-person seminar, and the university I was teaching at was very yes, we are in person. But you know what? I had a Zoom link that each class session, if someone said, hey, I'm going to be traveling or I'm sick or when I can't make it, can I have the Zoom link? Each session I'd send it to them. And there was one student who had a very young child and she lived fairly far from campus and she just got the link every week and it was fine. She was great. And we had most people in person and anywhere from 1 to 5 people on the Zoom and it was fine. These things don't have to be hard or disruptive or complex. There are, of course, some courses and content that do need hands-on training, but I think that there are ways, again, just to be humane, rational, and to be designing with student parents in mind so that you have a policy that makes sense for folks' real situations as they're coming to campus.
Great, thank you. That was super, super helpful. We also had a comment in here from Stephen Christopher, who said that they call it first day registration, and as parenting students, they have access to the registration on the first day, and that's open any semester. So some audience participation there, and certainly welcome that. We are going to be transitioning here in a minute or two to audience questions, and so I would welcome anybody to drop any questions that they have for our panelists here into the Q&A feature, which should be on the bottom of your screen here on Zoom. I think you can also direct message those to me as well, and we can transition to those in a minute here. One of the things that I just wanted to flag before we transition to those questions, we're having a lot of conversations across higher education about how students can engage in work-based learning opportunities, because work-based learning has shown to help with kind of the outcomes component of the, access to success to outcomes component of how we evaluate higher education. We see in the data that student parents are working, right, and working for pay. And as Allyson highlighted from some of our student financial wellness survey data, need to work for pay. So what does this kind of work-based learning, or, whether it be internships or short internships or other components, look like for student parents? And how can we make sure that access to those are equitable for student parents moving forward?
Yeah, I can start us off here. So we know that the vast majority of student parents are often already working for pay. About 72% of our student parents are working, and then 66% of the student parents are working more than 40 hours a week, compared to just 34% of non-parenting students. So there's already a really big disparity there. And then I think what's really crucial for us, we know from the data and from research and best practices that these students need to work for pay to make ends meet. And so kind of working together with these student parents to find opportunities for them to have paid work-based learning opportunities is really essential, as they don't have the time or the resources to accept unpaid work-based learning positions like traditional unpaid internships. So that's just really crucial for us to think about as we center this population.
It's also important to think about the types of fields that student parents want to go into. Obviously, there's a lot of heterogeneity, diversity here, but some certain fields are overrepresented. Student parents are more likely to go into health fields, and we know those require a lot of internships, which schools may or may not have much control over. But think about what they do have control over: lab schedules. A lot of those science classes require labs, and those are not offered at a wide variety of times. So offering labs at a variety of times throughout the day to support those work schedules, whether that means it's during the day right after class, so students don't have to leave and come back, or if that's in the evening once somebody else can take care of the child. We did a survey in New Mexico of students at 9 different community colleges, and we asked questions about scheduling preferences. The answer is there is no answer. Everybody wants something different. So really, it's about offering a variety of options.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you all. So I'm going to transition. We have a couple questions here from the audience, and I'll transition to those. And then we'll leave about 5 or so minutes at the back end for our panelists to kind of give closing thoughts. And also, if you had any major policy initiatives that you could wave a magic wand and get implemented at the federal, state, or institutional level, what would those be? So I'll plant that seed now. One of the first questions we had here in the chat was, how can we bring awareness to a rural area? The individual that asked this is a career navigator at a college center in a small town, and the majority of students are parents, but it seems like, and if I get this wrong, certainly welcome any clarity in the chat, but it seems like maybe there's a little bit of a disconnect of some of the support services and the opportunities for students to go back and making sure that they're able to support them in that rural area. But also, if you do have anything that you see from data that disproportionately impacts rural students, I think it would be important to maybe highlight that as well.
So we have a Skills and Training and Action Research Fellowship Program, STAR Fellow, and we have a STAR Fellow from California who's doing fabulous research on exactly the issues affecting student parents in rural areas. And that's going to be, she's presented it recently at the Education Equity Forum, but we'll be putting out a brief from her research very soon that's specifically looking at the qualitative experiences of rural student parents in California is where she focused. That said, we work with a lot of rural institutions in the Data to Action campaign, and we're also working on a project in partnership with the American Indian College Fund with 3 rural tribal colleges and universities, looking at how to think about family friendliness in a rural tribal context and rural institutions. So there's a lot, of course, that can be said about this. I think that rural areas have major assets. We don't want to only put this in a deficit frame. So I'm going to acknowledge that, and I'm going to talk about some of the challenges. So I think of course, there's like infrastructure, there's distance, there's technology, there's transportation. There are additional challenges to students being able to physically get to a campus or to be able to engage in online learning, although there are infrastructural investments that are coming from the federal government that are helping some of that, but it's somewhat slow and not always equally accessible or affordable. But one of the other big things that's come up in conversation is the challenge of like the housing or the childcare market. There's just less available. Like in urban areas, you talk about affordability and it still can be hard to find things. But in rural areas, you literally just might not have childcare providers. You literally might not have housing options. And so thinking about how students can meet those fundamental needs in an environment that just doesn't have the like, the opportunities there, it just gets, more difficult from a policy or strategy perspective when you can't, it's not just about navigating to resources, it's that the resources don't exist in the community. And so then it's what's the role of the institution in either helping develop or support those resources, and at what point does the college feel like it's sort of overstepping its role in the community in becoming sort of a multifaceted social service agency in addition to a college. And I don't have an easy answer for that. I do know that there is a lot of, desire to be thinking about how to support rural student parents, and that I think it's going to take additional targeted investments from state and federal government entities to recognize that rural issues, don't only relate to the infrastructure of technology and transportation, but also thinking about the infrastructure of fundamental supports that support family well-being broadly, let alone student parent well-being. I can go on more with that, but those are some of the issues that have been emerging in that conversation.
Great, thank you. That was a great answer. Next question that we had here was a follow-up to some of the points about faculty engagement, and in particular, some of the flexibility and how to make faculty more engaged in supporting student parents. And the question is really, have you heard of any effective strategies for encouraging professors or faculty to take this approach? Most want to do it, but they want to, know how to do it, but they want to do it, not be told to do it, I think is the way that question's worded. And so any tips there?
I was pausing for Renee to jump in first. Her brother's a professor, but I have a lot to say on that. I just didn't want to be the only one to respond to these questions. Renee, do you have something you want to share?
No, I have a disheartening story, but I don't think I have anything super useful here.
I have a lot of thoughts on this, so I'll share them. Allyson, please do jump in if you have additional ones to share. My mother's a faculty member. I grew up as a faculty family, so a lot of perspective on this. The biggest thing about faculty, so yes, you can do professional development and you can do leadership training, but there's two dynamics when it comes to faculty. One relates to adjunct faculty, especially at community colleges, especially in career and technical education programs. A large portion of faculty are not regular employees of the college. They're on contract or they're adjunct. And the way that these things often work is that those faculty members are hired usually not terribly long before the semester starts, and are usually not given very much ramp up time to prep for like the content, let alone all these other things. So there's actually there's a really good set of recommendations out of a different project about how to do professional development for adjunct faculty, but you have to pay them for it. You have to make it accessible for them, and you have to offer it at a time and in a way that they can meaningfully engage and feel like they can know concretely how to integrate it into their work. Not just this is important, but here's literally how you accommodate student parents in a welding class in a really concrete way. So the adjunct faculty is one prong of the issue, and that I think is largely a professional development discussion, and you can't just offer it, you have to facilitate access for them. The second prong are regular faculty, and especially at more elite institutions or more select whatever, tenure faculty don't like being told what to do, but they will do things that they think their peers are doing. So really, it's about not telling them what to do. It's not really, somewhat professional development and information sharing, but honestly, it's about building momentum among a few faculty champions who can then build that appetite and interest among their peers and colleagues. And it might also involve going into professional spaces like conferences or other events to be able to normalize that these practices are things that folks need to be thinking about. In research institutions, teaching is not mainly what faculty are responsible for. They are responsible for research, and in some places, teaching isn't even that highly valued, which is kind of a whole other thing. So getting faculty to think about this and to think about changing their teaching practice to be super accessible to students. I'll say community colleges are much more teaching and instruction oriented, and I think are easier sell. But when you're in these like more selective four-year spaces, you are really going to get further by having it become sort of a cultural standard and sort of an accepted practice among faculty with their peers than telling them much of anything directly.
That's great. Thank you. Another question that we have here is one of my favorite and least favorite questions, and always was a challenge for me when I worked on a campus, and that is, how do you deal with legal liability, right? So a lot of the pushback that campuses get around things like on-campus childcare, for example, and this was not in the question, that's me editorializing the question, but the question was, when it comes to creating a more child-friendly campus, the main pushback, or a lot of the pushback that they receive, is related to legal liability. And so are there any resources or, kind of things that can be maybe helpful to individuals as they have those conversations with general counsel or others on campus?
I was giving a polite pause. I have thoughts on this too. Allyson, I want to give you space. Do you have thoughts on this before I dive in?
I do, but I think probably you can offer a more comprehensive approach so I can kind of fill in the gaps.
Please do. I really appreciate that. I'll say that this is largely, if you ask risk management, the attorneys at the college, anything, their default answer is going to be, let's just take the most conservative approach. So a lot of times this is a factor that relates to leadership and the desire of institutional leaders to be able to advocate for and support that this is important for students to be able to bring to have belonging on campus, and that an important element of that is to have safe spaces for them to bring their children. You can establish spaces that are family friendly, whether that's library study spaces. That's been growing, and there's actually a really nice book about how libraries are partners in student parent work that came out recently. Whether that's athletic or gym spaces, whether that's portions of the library, whatever. It might be certain different spaces that, I just said library, but we think about different spaces on campus where it's kind of acceptable and welcome for children to be. The other thing, though, colleges already have minors on campus. So really, this is, from my perspective, a double standard. Minors are on campus because they are enrolled in the institution, whether that's because they're dual enrollment students with high school or because they are regular students who are 16, 17 years old who are enrolled. And also, colleges are often hosting like summer camps and other events that are that have children on campus. So I think a lot of it, I think this is actually a really great suggestion of something to like start doing model policy about and like sharing out best practice. But a lot of it is about pointing out where that double standard is disenfranchising to an important segment of the student population, and where the college needs to reconcile its own internal policies for consistency so that it's not just about risk mitigation, because there are really important considerations around unattended minors on campus. But if you have a minor who's with their parent, who's being supervised by or a parent or another responsible adult, the risk is very low. And so trying to figure out how to have that conversation in a reasonable way is important, but it's going to involve the engagement of institutional leadership to make it effective with the attorneys.
Great. Well, thank you all for the questions. And we had one more real quick that Allyson, I can throw to you if you have a second, which was, are there specific topics for financial literacy education, those pieces that are impactful for student parents? And then we'll give everybody here a minute after that to close out.
Yeah, great. I think something that I immediately just want to touch on and I think this is useful for all students, but especially our student parents, is just education on predatory credit sources, including payday loans and auto title loans. We see student parents disproportionately rely on these resources compared to our non-parenting students. In the 2023 Student Financial Wellness Survey, we saw 12% of our parenting students use a payday loan in 2023. compared to just 3% of our non-parents. And so I think just kind of doing preventive education on that. And, we see it in college towns around college campuses that there are payday and auto title loans closely located near campus. And I think just in general, enhancing education on that, and especially kind of echoing what Dr. Ryberg said, just making sure that our financial aid officers know and are able to coach these students in terms of looking at their cost of attendance and figuring out how to maximize their financial aid packages.
Great. Thanks, Allyson. So Allyson, I'll start with you. If you have any closing thoughts, like one data point or something to highlight, and then any policies, federal, state, or institutional that you would love to see adopted, and then can go to Theresa and Renee.
Yeah, I think I'm really excited to see California and Texas and other states kind of leading the way and requiring priority registration, whatever that means, and kind of centering student parents by prioritizing creating student advocates and having peer support groups for parents. I think these are great policies, but I've heard from a lot of our institutional partners here in Texas that there's been little guidance or funding available to help support these initiatives or implement them into practice. And so I think looking at that broadly and thinking about, okay, let's not only support our student parents, but let's provide the guidance that we need for these institutions to be able to implement that into practice and kind of carry out these policies on their campuses.
Thank you. Theresa?
I'll just share the statistic that though we talked about student parents being strong students, only 17% complete a degree in 6 years versus 50% of non-parenting students. And we have data showing that when parents complete college degrees, not only does it result in long-term economic benefits for themselves. They have almost $9,000 a year on average of earnings gains for the rest of their working life, relative to about $2,700 just by enrolling, including completers and non-completers. But we see payoffs for their children, where their children are also much more likely to complete high school, enroll in college, and get a college degree. Their children are 38% more likely to get a college degree themselves, and their children experience earnings gains of about $5,400 a year. So there's huge intergenerational payoffs, and there's also huge payoffs to states in supporting student parents, where taxpayers also reap benefits of increased graduation and tax payments and reduced benefit costs. So I can share a couple resources about that, but there's huge payoffs from doing this, and it's really important to promote not only access, but completion.
All right, and I will close us out with another intergenerational point, which is student parents are motivated by their children. If you ask them why they're going to college, you see about 2/3 say to earn more money and be self-sufficient, like why everybody goes to college. And about 2/3 will say to set a good example for my kid. So they're coming with this extra boost of motivation that students without children don't have. And it's our job to help them live that out.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for your time today. And thank you to everybody for joining us. Really appreciated the discussion and your expertise on this topic. And so thankful for everybody who tuned in across the country, and hopefully we'll watch the recording hereafter, because it means that we're really seeing a growth in institutions that are prioritizing these conversations on campus. And so thank you again for your time and expertise as panelists. And thank you to everybody for tuning in. I hope everybody has a great rest of your week.